Hi, thanks for joining us for another episode of Tea and Trowels, the series from the Florida Public Archaeology Network, where we talk with archaeologists about their research and what archaeology means to them. I'm Emily Jane Murray, one of your hosts, and today I'm thrilled to be chatting with Lindsay Block, the collections manager for the Ceramic Technology Lab at the Florida Museum of Natural History. Hi, Lindsay, how's it going?
Hi, good to talk to you. I'm doing well.
Thanks for joining us. Would you like to say anything else about yourself and then tell us about which mug you selected?
Sure. So yes, I'm Lindsay Block. I started my career as a historical archaeologist, and now I am working with Florida archaeology collections, mainly before colonization. So I'm kind of doing it all now that I'm down here. And my mug today is my go-to mug that I use every day that I'm here in the lab, that was made by my potter mentor, True Bennett, when I was an apprentice of hers. And so it's nostalgic for me. And then I also like it because I study pottery and do pottery. It tells me a lot of things. So it's actually a flawed pot. It's a second. It would have been, it's one that we couldn't sell. And that's because it's a two-face. So it's nice and pretty celadon on this side, and then it got too hot too fast on this side in the kiln, so it's all gnarly and like knobbly and kind of alligator skin on this side. So it's kind of demonstrates the ideal and then too often what happens. So it's a little bit of I don't know, makes me recognize how skilled a potter is to produce something that works. Because I also have a bunch of archaeological or historical mugs here, and so this one doesn't hold water anymore, but it does have frogs in it. So I just want to show you that one.
That's cute. Well, I brought my calamity ware mug in your honor because, as you're saying, you know, pottery can tell us stories, and I think this is a good one to remind us in 2020 that at least there's no giant toads yet. It could be worse, right?
Very good point.
So what made you want to become an archaeologist?
So in some ways, I think it was preordained that I was going to study old things. So I grew up in the country on a farm and spending a lot of time outside. So that seemed like a normal kind of place for me to be. And then a lot of my family are antique dealers. And so I grew up sort of outside, learning how to figure out like where the old road was running through the woods, and then in flea markets learning to tell the difference between silver plate and coin silver. And so this appreciation for old things and the and recognition of the past in our current environment, I think is something that I just got from an early age. And so then when I went to undergrad, I studied anthropology and was really invested in kind of all four fields, and ended up after graduation living abroad and doing more kind of things in the cultural anthropology realm, working with living populations. And now that I'm, and then I ended up coming back to the US and got a job as a shovel bum and fell in love with archaeology because it really sort of does it all for me. You get the manual labor, which is really satisfying. And then you get the lab work and the writing where you're thinking really hard about what that manual labor meant, like what you found out. And then you get to explain it to other people. So you get to do all of it.
Yeah, it's a good science to me to have like the manual physical part, you know, with the thinking part. It's a good balance. So well, could you tell us a little bit about your research in 30 seconds or so?
Sure. So my research kind of fundamentally is concerned with how people interacted with their environments and with each other in the past. And so those are really big questions. But the material that I use to study that is pottery, for one, because pottery is really durable. So it's something that we usually find on archaeological sites of a certain age. And it tells us so much about where people were going in their environments and what they were doing, and how they were making these things that were imbued with their cultural knowledge and sometimes their identity, and trading them and carrying them with them and selling them. And so it's a way to materialize networks and interactions and relationships that are otherwise invisible. And so for me, it's just fascinating. And I think it's surprising to a lot of people that my favorite pottery is really kind of the Tupperware of history. So it's the kind of stuff that doesn't have decoration usually and just kind of looks like nubbins of dirt to a lot of people, but it still has a lot of information. And so I'm really kind of the champion of the underdog of the utilitarian pot for cooking or food storage that that is important because it's what was being used every day for daily life. And I really think that that's one of the ways that we can connect to people in the past is through the things that they were using every day. Just the same way that like I have a really strong attachment to my cast iron skillet, that like it's not an object of beauty that I put on a shelf to display, but it's something that I would be devastated if I lost because I use it every day and it is important to me. So
yeah, the fancy like porcelain and fine china that you pull out once a year, it's like we're not even really connected to that stuff, right? Yeah. It's a really good way of thinking about it. So what is your favorite tool in your toolkit?
So, especially because I'm often looking at little bits of pottery or things that don't have a lot of decoration and things, my favorite tool is my microscope, which sits here on my desk, and I turn it on multiple times a day just to get and take a look at something under it, just to figure out what's in it, to learn more about how something was made. It's just a really handy tool to get a better set of eyes on these objects that I'm analyzing. So yeah, and if I'm out in the field, then I have a loop or a different kind of magnifying glass to see things.
Get a closer look at all of it. See what
Exactly.
secrets it can tell us.
What's that?
So to see what secrets it can tell us, right?
Exactly.
Do you have a best worst field story that you can now laugh about?
That's tough for me right now because most of the work that I do is here in the lab. So being out in the field seems very rosy, and field work is such a special time that I'm and my last couple of field experiences have been in the Caribbean, and they've just been like incredible, like Indiana Jones once in a lifetime sort of things. So
you could tell the best worst lab story as well. I'm sure there's some good ones in.
I didn't even think of that. I should have, but I can't think of a field story that I think will fit. So we were working in a pretty rural area, so we had to drive a couple hours to get to it, and we were going back to a site that hadn't been excavated in a couple of years, and so things had really grown up. And to get to it, we had to park like a mile away and then haul all of our stuff through the woods and through water at times. And so we were wearing boots up to our knees to try to keep the water out, but invariably it got in. And so then you have wet socks all day and you're wearing these muck boots, which aren't great for excavating and things. And so we got to site and it was already like, it had been a day of, it had felt like a day to get there. And we start clearing site and we want to reestablish our grid. So we have to find our survey markers. And so these are pieces of rebar or big nails that have been put in by a surveyor that have really specific location information. So like a really precise GPS coordinate. And we need those to make sure that we stay on grid so that we're using the same grid that was used before and that it relates to the real world. And so we looked for it and we looked for it and we looked for this survey marker and we couldn't find it. And we knew we were looking in the same sort of general area and we just couldn't find it. And so we couldn't do anything else. We couldn't excavate or lay out excavation squares until we knew where our grid was. And so we were kind of stuck. And so we ended up having to call it quits a little bit early and haul back through the water. And then I drove a couple of hours the other direction to pick up a metal detector, which is something that historical archaeologists use fairly often, but working in pre-Columbian contexts, we typically don't. And so it wasn't something that we had with us. And so I went and borrowed one from a friend and then drove a couple hours back so we'd be ready to go out the next day. And then hauled back out with the metal detector, trying to keep it dry the next day, and turned it to relic mode. Seriously. And within like 30 seconds, found that metal nail, the survey marker. And it was just like, it was, of course, right where we had been looking, but we just hadn't seen it. And so it was, at the time, the best worst, because it was the best case scenario and that we'd found it, but it was the worst in that the past like 24 hours had been a real pain. So.
Always right where you thought it was, but couldn't find it, right?
Exactly.
Well, I'm glad you found that.
Yes.
So our big question here for the end, how do you think archaeology can help save the world?
Oof. So there's a lot of hubris in that question, but I do think that archaeology has important roles to play. I think for me, archaeology is so valuable in showing us the diversity of ways that humans have figured out to live in our world, and seeing all of these different kinds of adaptations to our environment, all these different cultural ways that we've found to work with each other. I think that I find a lot of hope in that we as humans can figure out better ways to work within our environment instead of against it, can figure out better ways to work with other people. And so I think by showing that resilience in the face of things like climate change, which is something that's been going on throughout human history in different ways across the world, and cultural change, that we can see some ways to move forward. And then also, because a lot of my work has been done working with in historical contexts, I'm particularly interested in the ways that archaeology can speak to people who have been left out of history, have been specifically excluded from historical narratives. And so working on sites of where enslaved people lived, I've found it's really, the things that we find really help me and others, I think, to humanize these people who often we don't even know their names, but we can see the things that they made for themselves and the things that they purchased for themselves and the autonomy that they created in their own lives to give themselves some of the humanity that was being that others were actively trying to take away from them, I think is really valuable.
Yeah, material culture has a way of illustrating we're all more similar than we realize in the end. So even though there's the vast range of different types of pottery or glass or metal or tools, right? It's all some basic shapes and functions in there. You know.
Right, and so you find you can find one artifact that totally changes. So I'm thinking of a lot of my work has been done at Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's plantation, where over 200 slaves lived at many points in time. We found at one site a tiny kind of a nail, but it had been formed into a fish hook. And we know that the nail boys, so there were enslaved boys who were 10 to 12 years old or 14 who were working in this hot, terrible blacksmith shop making nails day in and day out at Monticello. And so to see that they were it seems like also making things for themselves during that time, or maybe they were making things like that and selling them to other people on the plantation and developing their own sort of illicit economy, or just, you know, on their day off going down to the Rivanna River and taking that and fishing with it and getting some extra food and relaxation. I think that that artifacts like that just are exceedingly special and and speak to us across time.
Definitely. Well, we have one last bonus question. What's been keeping you sane in 2020?
Oof, dogs for sure. Four-legged friends are so critical to my well-being, in terms of getting me out for one, but also just comfort in general and amusement. And then also finding hands-on things to do. So for work earlier this year, even when we weren't coming into the lab, I started a little project where I was practicing techniques of pottery production and making not quite replicas, but sort of testing out a technique that past people used to make pottery here in Florida. And I wrote up a little blog about that. And I've been cooking a lot more than I normally would, and doing other little kind of craft activities, and just trying to have things that keep me off of Zoom as much as possible and off of the computer as much as possible.
Very, very crucial to sanity this year. Less screen time.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, very cool. Thanks for taking some time to chat with us, and thanks to everyone for watching at home. Cheers.
Cheers.